It happened, I was on the floor of my childhood bedroom, staring up at the water stain on the ceiling I'd memorized as a kid. The one that looked like a running horse. I used to think it was lucky. My stepbrother's boot connected with my ribs before I could process what was happening. The second kick told me this wasn't stopping on its own. I want to tell you how I got there. Because if I just start with the floor, you'll think I was weak. And I need you to understand, I was anything but. My name is Petra. I was 29 years old, a staff sergeant in the United States Army, and I had just returned from my second deployment in 8 years. I'd done things in the field that I still can't talk about. I'd carried wounded men twice my size. I'd made decisions in seconds that most people never have to make in a lifetime. None of that prepared me for coming home. My mother remarried when I was 14. His name was Stuart. Broad shoulders, easy smile, the kind of man who volunteers at church barbecues and then borrows $20 from you and forgets about it. I never trusted him, but my mother looked lighter around him, so I kept my mouth shut. When I enlisted at 18, partly it was patriotism, partly it was geography. Getting out of that house felt like survival. My stepbrother Kevin was 17 when Stuart moved in. He was the kind of boy who grew into the kind of man who talks loudly at restaurants and sends food back twice. He'd had 3 jobs in the last 4 years that I knew of. He borrowed money from my mother twice that she told me about. He called me G.I. Jane the first Thanksgiving after I shipped out, and everyone laughed. And I'd laughed too because sometimes that's just easier. I came home in late October. My mother had been asking me to visit for months. She'd had a health scare, nothing confirmed yet, just chest pain that kept her up at night, and a cardiologist appointment she didn't want to go to alone. I had 30 days of leave. I figured I'd spend the first week with her, make sure she was okay, and then head down to see friends in Austin. I should have gone straight to Austin. The house felt wrong the moment I pulled into the driveway. Kevin's truck was there, which I hadn't expected. He was supposed to be living with his girlfriend in Raleigh. Stuart's sedan was parked half on the lawn, which was new. The garden my mother used to keep along the front walkway was overgrown. The marigolds she'd planted every spring for the last decade gone to weeds. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She looked thinner. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. "How long has Kevin been here?" I asked quietly over her shoulder. She pulled back. "A few weeks. He and Stephanie had some trouble. He just needed a place to land." I nodded. I'd learned a long time ago that a few weeks and just needed to land were phrases my mother used when the real answer was something she didn't want to say out loud. The first 2 days were fine, the way things are fine when everyone is being careful. Stuart shook my hand at dinner and asked about the food overseas. Kevin scrolled his phone and grunted responses. My mother made pot roast and asked about my plans, and I helped her with the dishes. And at night I lay in my old room staring at that water stain on the ceiling and reminded myself it was temporary. The cardiologist appointment was on a Wednesday. The doctor was kind and direct, stress-induced, likely nothing structural, but she needed to reduce her cortisol levels and get more sleep. I sat in the waiting room and thought about the fact that my mother was being consumed by stress in her own home, and I could see exactly where it was coming from. That evening, I came back to find Kevin sitting in the living room in full uniform. My uniform. He'd gone into my room while I was out, opened my duffel, and pulled out my dress greens, the ones I wore to my promotion ceremony. He had the jacket on, unbuttoned, beer in hand, walking around the living room doing an impression of someone saluting. "Ten Hut," he said when he saw me, and snapped a mock salute with the hand holding the beer. I stood very still in the doorway. Stuart was on the couch. He didn't say anything. He had the particular stillness of a man who was waiting to see which direction things would go. "Take it off," I said. "Relax. I'm just messing around. Kevin." I said it the way I said things in the field. Flat, final. "Take it off now." He looked at Stuart. Something passed between them. One of those silent conversations men have when they've decided together how a scene is going to go. Kevin shrugged the jacket off and dropped it on the floor. Not on the couch. Not on the chair. On the floor. I walked over, picked it up, folded it. I didn't say anything else. I went back to my room and locked the door. That night, I heard them in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but the walls in that house were thin and they weren't being quiet. "She's always been like this," Kevin said. "Thinks the uniform makes her special. She doesn't respect this family, Stuart said. Never has. So why's she here? A pause. Then Stuart lower. She won't be for long. I sat on my bed for a long time after that. I thought about calling a friend. I thought about packing up and leaving that night. I thought about my mother's face in the waiting room. How she'd held my hand when the doctor came back in. How she'd whispered, "I'm glad you're here." I stayed. That's the thing I have to live with. I stayed because she asked me to. 2 days later, a man named Harold came to the door. I didn't know him yet. I'd seen him a few times in the neighborhood. Older, Vietnam-era veteran, widowed, lived 3 houses down. He was in a wheelchair now, had been for about 2 years after a fall that his daughter told my mother about at a block party. He had the kind of face that made you think he'd been handsome once, and still had a quality about him that made you want to stand up straight. He knocked on the door to ask if we had jumper cables. His car battery had died in the driveway and his daughter was 40 minutes away. I was the one who answered. I told him I had cables in my car and I'd pull it around. It would take 10 minutes. Kevin appeared in the hallway behind me. "Tell him to call roadside assistance," he said, not quietly. "We're not a charity." I ignored him. I grabbed my keys. Kevin stepped around me and stood in the doorway. "Look," he said to Harold, "she's busy. You got a phone? Call AAA." Harold looked at Kevin, then at me. "I don't want to be any trouble." "You're no trouble," I said, and stepped past Kevin onto the porch. Kevin grabbed my arm. And here is the thing that people in the comments will never fully understand, no matter how many times I try to explain it. When someone you grew up alongside grabs your arm, there is a fraction of a second, maybe less, where your body doesn't know if this is the beginning of violence or just a stupid argument. And in that fraction of a second, you make a choice. My training told me one thing. My history with this person told me another. I hesitated. "Let go of my arm," I said. "You think you can just walk around here giving orders?" His voice had changed. "You think because you went and played soldier for a few years that you run this house?" "Kevin." I kept my voice steady. "Let go." "Dad's right," he said. "You don't respect anyone here. You never have." Stuart appeared at the end of the hallway. He didn't move toward us. He just stood there, watching. I pulled my arm free. I turned toward the door. The first hit came from behind. I don't remember the exact sequence. I remember the floor. I remember the cold of the linoleum in the entryway because my face was against it. I remember the sound of Harold's voice saying, "Stop. Stop it," from somewhere above me and outside. I remember thinking, very clearly and strangely, that I needed to protect my hands because I'd need them. Kevin had hit me from behind, and then, when I went down, it kept going. Stuart pulled him back twice and let him go twice, which tells you everything you need to know about Stuart. Harold had his phone out, was calling 911. He was yelling. I heard my mother's voice from the top of the stairs. She'd come home from her walk and was standing at the top of the stairs in her coat screaming Kevin's name, and nobody was listening. By the time the police arrived, I had 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a split lip, and a concussion that would keep me out of everything for the next 6 weeks. Kevin's version, given to the first officer on scene, I had come at him first. I had combat training. I was dangerous. He was defending himself and his father. Stuart's version, given 2 minutes later, he hadn't seen how it started, but his son seemed frightened. He'd tried to stop it. The officer looked at me on the ground and looked at Kevin standing in the hallway with a bruised knuckle from where his fist had caught the doorframe, and I watched him do the math that people do when they see a woman who should have been able to stop something and didn't. I could see the question forming behind his eyes. Why didn't she fight back? Because Kevin is someone I spent 3 years living with as a teenager. Because I didn't want to put a man in the hospital in front of my mother. Because sometimes training is the thing that tells you what not to do. I didn't say any of this at the scene. I was focused on breathing. The hospital was white and loud, and my mother sat beside my bed and cried with her hands in her lap, not reaching for me in the way of someone who has been punished for reaching before. I watched her and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with my ribs. "You should go home," I told her. "I'm staying. He's still there." She didn't answer. I closed my eyes. My unit chaplain reached out that night. I'd notified my CO before they admitted me because that's protocol when active duty personnel are involved in an incident. My first sergeant called. My CO called. There was a formal inquiry initiated because assaulting active duty military personnel carries federal implications that a local incident report doesn't fully capture, and someone in the chain had made sure that flag was raised. Kevin and Stuart did not know this yet. The charges they'd filed against me, claiming I'd initiated, fell apart inside 48 hours. Harold had filmed the last portion of it on his phone. He hadn't told anyone. He just stood there in his wheelchair, on my mother's front porch, and held up his phone with shaking hands and recorded what he could. 40 seconds of footage. Kevin's back. The sound of impact. My mother screaming. Stuart standing in the hallway doing nothing. Harold gave it to the police the morning after without being asked. I was in the hospital for 4 days. On the 3rd day, a man walked into my room in full dress uniform. 3 stars on his shoulders. He was my brigade commander, CO. Someone I'd never met in person, someone whose name I knew from briefings and commendations. He sat down in the chair next to my bed without ceremony, and he looked at me the way people look at each other when they've both been in places that changed them. Staff Sergeant, he said. How are you feeling? Better than yesterday, sir, I said, which was true. Good? He folded his hands. I want you to know that what happened to you is being taken seriously at every level. The federal filing is moving forward. And I want you to hear this directly from me. This Army considers you family. What's done to one of ours is done to all of us. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until he left. What I didn't know until later, what my nurse told me, and then my first sergeant confirmed, was that Harold had called his daughter the night of the incident. His daughter had posted something on a local veterans Facebook group asking for prayers for a neighbor. By the 3rd day of my hospitalization, there were 47 veterans and active duty personnel in the parking lot of that hospital. By the morning of my discharge, there were over 100. Not protesting, not causing a scene, just standing there in their jackets and their caps and their varying degrees of mobility in the October cold. Because Harold had asked them to show up, and they had. My mother came to get me. She walked out of the hospital entrance, and she stopped when she saw them. All those people standing in the parking lot. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she walked to Harold, who was parked near the entrance in his chair, and she said something to him I couldn't hear. He nodded. She came back to me and took my good arm. She told me later that she'd said, "Thank you for seeing her when I was too scared to." I won't walk you through every detail of the legal process because honestly, it was long and it was exhausting, and it is not the most important part of the story. What I will tell you is this. Kevin pleaded guilty to felony assault of a military service member. Stuart faced accessory charges that were ultimately reduced, but it cost him his job. He worked for a government contractor with a security clearance, and that clearance does not survive a criminal record. They were removed from my mother's house as a condition of bond. My mother filed for divorce 4 months later. I drove down from Fort Bragg for the court date. I sat beside her and held her hand. The house got quieter. The garden came back. I helped her plant marigolds in the spring. I still think about that moment in the doorway. The fraction of a second. People ask me, people who don't know me, why someone with my training would let it get that far. And I understand the question. I do. But what I want them to understand is that training doesn't erase love, even the complicated, scarred-over kind. I didn't hesitate because I was weak. I hesitated because Kevin was, for 3 years, something close to a brother. And some part of me, some small, stubborn, human part, spent half a second hoping he would stop on his own. He didn't. That's on him. What happened next is on him, and on his father, and on the 47 people who showed up in a hospital parking lot in October because an old man in a wheelchair made a phone call. Harold and I have coffee sometimes when I'm back in town. He doesn't make a big deal of it, neither do I. We talk about the weather and his daughter's new baby, and sometimes about places we've both been that we don't describe in detail. He has a way of listening that makes you feel like what you're saying matters, even when you're not saying much. Last time I visited, I brought him a cutting from my mother's marigolds. He planted it next to his front walk. I don't know why that made me cry on the drive back to the highway. Maybe because some things, once broken, find a different shape. Not worse, just different. I don't regret staying that night. I regret that I had to. There's a gap between those two things, and I've learned to live inside it. Trust your gut. I know that sounds simple. It isn't. But when something tells you the air has changed in a room, when the stillness in a man's posture tells you he's waiting for permission rather than meaning to stop anything. Listen to that. Your body knows before your mind catches up. Mine did. I just gave it 1 second too long to hope. That second cost me 6 weeks and 2 cracked ribs, and 1 very long look at the water stain on my childhood ceiling. What it gave me back was harder to name. But it's real, and it's mine, and no one who stood in that hallway and said nothing will ever be able to touch it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about cause and effect, not in any grand philosophical way, just in the quiet, practical way you think about things when you've had 6 weeks of recovery time and nowhere to be. Kevin made a choice that night. So did Stuart. So did Harold. So did I. And every single one of those choices had a consequence that followed it as naturally as a shadow follows a person in the afternoon light. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just how things work when you pay attention. Kevin chose to mock the uniform. Then he chose to grab my arm. Then he chose not to stop. And each choice locked in the next one, the way a bad turn on a highway takes you further and further from where you meant to go. By the time the police arrived, he had already made every decision that would define the next several years of his life. He just didn't know it yet. Stuart chose to stand in that hallway and do nothing. That nothing had a weight to it. A man with a security clearance, a government contract, a reputation in the neighborhood. He let all of it go in the time it takes to take 1 step forward and say stop. He didn't take that step. And the nothing he chose came back to him in the form of charges, a lost clearance, a job that evaporated, not as punishment handed down from somewhere above, just as the natural result of being the kind of man who watches and waits to see which way the wind blows. Harold chose to hold up his phone with shaking hands and record what he saw. He chose to call his daughter. He chose to ask people to show up. That's it, 3 small choices, and they rippled out into a parking lot full of people standing in the October cold because one old man in a wheelchair decided that what happened to me was worth bearing witness to. That's the thing I come back to most. Not the cracked ribs. Not the courtroom. Not even the general sitting in the chair next to my hospital bed. It's Harold and his phone. Because he didn't have training. He didn't have authority. He just had a clear sense of what was right and enough courage to act on it without waiting for someone else to go first. That's intelligence to me. Not the kind measured in tests, but the kind that sees a situation clearly and doesn't talk itself out of what it knows. Harold knew. He acted. The rest followed. And me? I chose to stay that night because my mother needed someone. That choice cost me something real, but I've made peace with it because it came from the right place, even if the outcome was brutal. What we choose out of love, even when it goes wrong, sits differently inside you than what we choose out of fear or selfishness. I can carry what happened to me. I couldn't carry walking out on her. The marigolds are back in her garden now. She planted them herself this spring. Small thing. Means everything. What people do in the moments that matter. When it's inconvenient, when it's costly, when no one is watching. That's the only real measure of character I've ever found. Not what they say. What they do when the door is open, and they could just as easily walk through it and keep going. Kevin walked through it. Stuart stood still. Harold lifted his phone. One of those men is drinking coffee with me when I come home. The other 2 are not. That's not a lesson. That's just what happened. Sometimes that's enough.